this week I need to take you down to a magical, mystical place, Australia. Which is less magical and more just... Listen, I don't mean to throw shade here, but you people are insane. And before we begin, I really need to thank one of your local residents. A member of my Discord server has brought this to my attention multiple times. It goes by the name AUNLMTT365. A truly wondrous name that rolls off the tongue. Thank you so much for that. And apparently, y'all just didn't know how to get with the program in terms of standardizing railway gauges. Now, when one discusses railway gauges, generally it means the distance between the rails. Basically, different lines have different spacing, and in the early days of railroading, this could vary quite a bit. But over time, most countries started realizing, hey, this is actually kind of a complete nightmare. Because as railways got larger, they had to link up and transfer to other rail lines, and it was kind of a pain when the cars in question couldn't actually run on a different railway's trackage. They either had to re-gauge the cars, which took time, or transfer the goods and/or people, which took time. Really, it was a nightmare. But plenty of countries got with the program relatively quick once they started noticing the issues. Even in privatized industries, governments would often issue legislation that standardized the gauges across the board that all railways would have to follow in order to streamline operations, and this is a completely reasonable thing to do. Sometimes even the railway companies would have agreements between each other to make sure everything was the same, just because it made everyone's lives easier. Australia didn't really get around to doing this until seemingly way after everybody else. And I understand some of you are going to point this out. Well, narrow gauges still exist, yeah, but those are smaller, niche railways. I'm talking about the main lines, the main hubs of the railroad industry. In Australia, they had completely different gauges all over the place for over a century. Like absolute maniacs. Look at this. Do you see this? Do you see this? Do you see this unbridled madness before your eyes? This is one of the several multi-gauge yards that existed within Australia. Why? Because multiple different railways had to use the yard, and they all used completely different gauges, so the yards had to accommodate them. This isn't normal, alright? How did we end up this way? Why was Australia like this? Well, I was inclined to look further into this because I needed some friggin' details. And I did wind up with it's an answer. It's not a good one, but it's an answer. And it involves a lot of government issues, because of course it does. As early as 1845, back when Australia was still directly under British control, a Royal Commission on Railway Gauges in the United Kingdom did report on the desirability for a uniform gauge. This resulted in the Regulating the Gauge of Railways Act of 1846. This act was passed and prescribed the use of the 4-foot, 8.5-inch gauge in England, Scotland, and Wales, with, at the time, the exception of the Great Western Railway, which seemingly always does their own thing. They also dictated a 5-foot, 3-inch gauge over in Ireland. The act didn't directly affect Australia, but with railways popping up over there too, in 1846, newspapers there started discussing the break of gauge problem in the United Kingdom. Break of gauge is just a blanket term that refers to a line of one track, meaning a line of a different track with a different gauge. And it's a pain, as you can imagine. Usually, it's only a problem between countries, as generally independent nations will get their act together on this pretty quick, but as I stressed, Australia was not one of these cases. In 1848, the Governor of New South Wales, Charles Fitzroy, was directly advised by the Secretary of State for the Colonies in London, Earl Grey, that one uniform gauge should be adopted in Australia, and he encouraged the British standard, 4-foot, 8.5 inches. And that recommendation was actually adopted by the, at the time, 3 colonies down in Australia. Grey would also note that South Australia was already using that gauge. So, if they already did it, what was the problem? Well, to begin with, not everyone got with that particular program, and communication between the UK and Australia was difficult at the time. Undersea cable communications with England didn't open until 1872, so any messages had to go by sailing ship, which was obviously ridiculously slow. The origins of the discrepancy between gauges can be traced back to the private railway, the Sydney Railway Company. They had begun planning their rail line to Parramatta. Their chief engineer was a man named Francis Webb Shields, and he was Irish-born. After he was appointed, he preferred the 5-foot 6-inch gauge, not the British standard, at least at first, but in 1850 he decided to change that and persuade the higher-ups to go with the Irish standard gauge of 5-foot 3 inches, a little smaller. It was endorsed by the New South Wales governor at the time, and Colonial Secretary Arrow Gray in London agreed to it in 1851. Shields and his subordinates actually resigned from the company in December of 1850, when they had their salaries cut. They would eventually select a new Scottish engineer named James Wallace, who preferred the British standard gauge, because of course he did. Then the government was persuaded again to change back to 4-foot 8.5 inches, like proper Brits, and the company was advised in January of 1853 that the act requiring 5-foot 3 inches would be repealed. Then in February of 1853, the other colonies, including Victoria, which became a thing in 1851, were sent a memorandum advising them of the pending change, and recommending that they likewise adopt it. But in Victoria, that was distributed to 3 different railway companies. The Melbourne and Hobson's Bay Railway Company asked for a determination for the government, as they had already planned for both gauges, and was due to send an order for locomotives and rolling stock to England by boat at the start of April. They kind of needed to know what gauge to set this stuff up for. They got a reply at the end of March, and the companies were told the colonial Victorian government preferred 5-foot 3 inches. So that's the order they placed. In July that same year, the government of Victoria then advised New South Wales that they were going to use a broader gauge because they wanted to be special, and they appealed to the British government to force a reversal of the New South Wales decision. After this, the Melbourne and Hobson's Bay Railway Company opened the first railway in Australia, and it would be 5-foot 3 inches, broad gauge. The South Australian Railways used the same in 1856. There was a request to reconsider this particular alteration, but in 1855 the New South Wales governor, William Denison, gave the go-ahead for their 4-foot 8.5 inch gauge on the Sydney to Parramatta Railway, which would open in September of that year. So already we can see a problem starting to develop quite quickly. There were concerns over this raised pretty much immediately. Like, everyone was like, yo, this is going to be a problem. Not might, it will be a problem. But at first, most protests and concerns were ignored because, at the time, there were just 23 miles of track, only 4 locomotives, and just a handful of rolling stock. It wasn't seen as a big deal, because what could possibly go wrong? Well, by 1889, New South Wales alone had built almost 1,950 miles of their standard gauge line. The problem only got worse. The 3-foot 6-inch narrow gauge was introduced to Australia in 1865, when Queensland Railways opened their first railway from Ipswich to Grantchester. They opted to go with that because they felt it would be cheaper and faster on curves than the wider gauges were. It was actually the first narrow gauge main line in the world, which is great, but you already have 2 other different competing gauges. Now we have 3. Guys, are we not communicating? What's going on? Well, South Australia adopted that gauge in 1867. Again, because of reduced cost. And they didn't expect that they would have to connect to broad gauge lines at the time, because they didn't have the ability to think logically, though in their defense, in those days there was severe criticism regarding the overabundance of English lines back in the UK. They had so much track, and it was getting out of control, and it was felt that this sort of thing could be avoided in Australia. It could not. The Western Australian Government Railways also adopted the narrow gauge in 1879, and then Tasmania opened their first railway in 1871 using 5-foot 3 inch broad gauge, but then converted it to 3-foot 6 inches in 1888 because I don't know what's happening, though in Tasmania's defense, they're an island. Like, they don't have to worry about the transfer issue. They could literally do whatever they want and not have a problem here. So we're gonna give them a pass. Despite the smart people in the room worried about it decades prior, it didn't really become a major problem until the 1880s. There weren't any connections between the separate systems prior to that, which, great, but then there were, and suddenly, the whole break of gauge thing became an issue. It was mentioned in an 1889 military defense report that was authored by British Army officer Major General James Bevan Edwards. He acknowledged the benefits of a railway, but did not think that they could be attained until they actually became uniform, and everyone was using the same gauge, like normal people. But Australia was kind of a weird case. Remember, they were colonies, not a united nation at the time. And until the turn of the 20th century, the benefits of having a uniform gauge weren't actually apparent because passengers actually had to pass through customs and immigration at the intercolonial border. So all the goods would have to be removed for a customs inspection anyway. For context, this would be like if you were to, say, travel from, I don't know, Michigan into Ohio, and you'd have to go through customs between the two. Like, obviously that's ridiculous, but the United States is, well, united. Australia wasn't that way back then. It was only with the Federation, established in 1901, that introduced free trade between the various states of Australia, that the whole customs issue became a non-factor, and it opened up travel quite a bit between the different sections of Australia, which is good, but the issue with gauges became way more obvious. When Australia became a federation, the quote-unquote standard gauge was only used in New South Wales. Which, okay, look, is it really standard if only one place is using it? Like, I get what we mean on a worldwide scale here, in terms of Britain and everything, but, if we're talking about Australia, I don't think that was standard at the time. The opposite of that, in fact. There were some early attempts to work on gauge conversion, but little progress was made. For a full understanding of how bad this was, to transport goods from Queensland to Perth, they needed to switch trains 4 times. You think at some point they might want to, I don't know, bite the bullet and choose a gauge? But no. In October of 1921, a royal commission, looking into the uniform rail gauge, recommended converting large areas of the country, pushing for 4 feet 8.5 inches. It was felt that pushing for the standard and making everything uniform was essential to development and the safety of the nation. Agreements were made to extend some already existing standard gauge lines, but, in terms of conversions, it didn't really happen that much. By the start of World War II, there were still 14 break-of-gauge locations on the main lines. They had over 1,600 extra personnel employed to transfer 1.8 million tons of freight during World War II, because, well, they had to transfer it. It was absurd. There were even special devices incorporated to try to remedy the situation instead of, actually converting the rails like normal people. No. No, people invented special stuff in order to do it. In 1922 alone, there were 273 inventions proposed to solve the break-of-gauge problem. Not a single one was adopted, and to be fair, they probably would have been a band-aid on an overall problem. See, the consistent issue I'm noticing with Australia in particular is that instead of doing the logical thing and, I don't know, re-gauging the rails to something uniform, they just kind of kept putting stopgaps in place in order to put off actually having to do that. As I showed you earlier, a bunch of their transfer yards were designed to have multiple gauges run over them. Multi-gauge lines were very normal, where pretty much anywhere else in the world, that had been stopped by the mid-1900s. Why are you like this? World War II, given how much extra stuff was being moved, really highlighted the problems here. Even General Douglas MacArthur allegedly said of Australia's gauge issue, "This is helping the enemy." Because, yeah, everything just took longer. But instead of fixing it, they just kept trucking on, in some areas putting dual gauge or even triple gauge lines. And I gotta be honest, I've never seen a country do so much extra work to keep from doing work. Like, re-gauging the lines would have made way more sense, is what I'm trying to say. And you probably thinking, oh, it was probably just the lines. Yeah, it's silly. But at least they standardize everything else, you fools. This is Australia. They standardize nothing. Even their couplers were different between railways. They had to make special attachments to fit them between each other because they couldn't even agree on that. These people live in a place of horrific venomous animals and saltwater crocodiles, and yet they cannot figure out that basic standardization would make all of their lives easier. It's like they want to suffer. I don't get it. In 1956, a government member's Rail Standardization Committee was finally established and began pushing for re-gauging a lot of the lines. The work took a lot of time. In fact, even by the 1980s, there were still a lot of multi-gauge sections. But, thankfully, by the modern day, they managed to get everything up to snuff. There are still narrow gauge lines, sure, but the main lines are actually standardized. For the most part. The most recent conversion happened with the Mildura Railway Line and the Murrayville Railway Lines in Victoria. They were converted to standard gauge in 2018. I don't know how it took y'all this long, but you got there. But with that, a special thank you goes to all my underwater train finders: Some Dude 267, Orange Glass, Benjamin Owens, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Jack Carson's Road Videos, Lord Off 444, Royal Hudson 2860, Isurfer 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matt Weaver, Tom Redlion, NS Productions 8104, Wheeljack 8401, Rescues Greyhounds, The Baxter, Caleb Crosswhite, Andrew Bowen, Josh Johnson, Caleb Brainwaters, Prez Drenton, Master of None, Travis Stalinsky, Jared Brussel, Joshua Long, Tommy Rossini, Ben McCullough, Panzer Kitson 131-232, Mark Holding, G Wiz, Mr. Terevel, Hayden DeGrow, Metal for Life Guy, Hannah Bird, No, Eric Hutton, Kirk Forkham, Ohio Trucker 1, Mitchell Cole, Mr. Sleepy, Dr. Racer 78, Nylon, AET Museum, Railroad Preserver 2000, Williard Conklin, Windy City Rails, and of course, my dad. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fun farewell.